Years before the March on Washington, the United States was a very hostile place for many men, women, and children of dark skin. This was especially true in the South, in many places like Alabama or Missouri. They faced constant ridicule and violence due to the color of their skin.
The Civil Rights Movement was a defining moment in the struggle for racial equality. The March on Washington brought about real change in the U.S. The March on Washington exposed the very real problems faced by the black community. The march pushed the civil rights movement and the works of the Big Six into the national spotlight and gave the movement much needed publicity, and showed that America was finally willing to listen to what these leaders of the black community had to say. The march was a peaceful protest that provided a composed outlet for the angst felt by the black community. This event also drew many white supporters to the cause. This was a big part of why the march was such a success and thus a turning point in history, because it not only had the support of the blacks, it also had the support of most white Americans.
Before the march, there were many acts of hatred committed towards black people, such as lynchings, hangings, and general violence. Many of these acts were commonplace in the South and Midwestern parts of the U.S. These acts were normally led by local members of what was known throughout the U.S. as the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK. This hate-driven organization performed several violent acts towards blacks during this time period. An example of this was the 16th Street church bombing in Alabama. Robert Chambliss, an identified KKK member, was seen getting out of a white Chevy and placing a box under the steps of the church. At 10:22, the bomb went off, and the blast killed 4 little girls. Denise McNair, 11. Addie Mae Collins, 14. Carol Robinson, 14. And Cynthia Wesley, 14. And injured 23 others, all of which were blacks. Chambliss was charged with murder, but was not found guilty by a jury composed of all white members. This is just one of the many examples of the danger, torture, and cruelty blacks faced in their everyday lives. What made the Klan so dangerous was the absence of boundaries and their ability to avoid consequences for their barbaric actions. This helped fuel their fire, and many white people took this notion that it was okay to be violent towards blacks, and that there would be no consequences.
The riots at the University of Missouri in 1962 only further exemplified this view. After the first black student ever was allowed to enroll at the university, James Meredith, huge riots ensued where many people were injured and some killed. The riots were compiled of normal, everyday people, students, and townspeople. Even teachers took part in this act. It took the National Guard to stop these riots. Even after these riots stopped, James always had 2 National Guard officers around at all times through his years at the university just to keep him safe. This example just shows how bad of a problem racism was in this country, and people of the black community turned towards their leaders, or the Big Six, as they were called in the press.
The Big Six took on many problems like segregation, police brutality, and the right for blacks to vote. These were all issues they addressed separately in their respective parts of the country. The Big Six was made up of leaders from 6 different civil rights groups. Whitney Young, president of the National Urban League. Roy Wilkins, president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. James Farmer, president of the Congress of Racial Equality. John Lewis, president of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Martin Luther King, Jr., founder and president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They separately made impacts in their communities like desegregating buses, because it was decided by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. Even though this was recognized as law to Dr. King and William Powell, they came up with a series of rules for blacks to follow while riding the bus as to not cause an uproar in the white community, and ultimately slow the civil rights movement. Dr. King's main point was to keep this movement totally peaceful so that there was no cause by anyone to try and stop it. They never really collaborated and went about solving these issues in their own ways until Randolph proposed this massive march and demonstration to bring these problems to light.
Another issue that blacks had was police brutality. During peaceful protests and other demonstrations like boycotts, police would violently break up these congregations by brute force. They used tactics like spraying crowds with fire hoses and also had dogs attack protesters. This was one of the biggest problems the movement faced and one of the biggest issues covered by the civil rights leaders at the March on Washington.
Finally, After all the arrangements were made and all the events consented by JFK, the march was given the green light. Over a quarter million people poured out of all parts of the country on August 28, 1963, to take a part in the March on Washington, blacks and whites. They came by way of train, bus, or car to support the movement and to have their voices heard. On the day of the march, more than 2,000 buses, 21 special trains, 10 chartered airliners, and uncounted cars converged on Washington. All regularly scheduled planes, trains, and buses were also filled to capacity. People marched through the streets of D.C. with unity and pride. They started at the Washington Monument and ended up at their final destination, the Lincoln Memorial. This was where the famous speeches of the march took place. The assembly was headed by speeches made by the people, in the following order: Reverend Patrick O'Boyle, A. Philip Randolph, Dr. Eugene Carson Blake, John Lewis, Walter Reuther, James Farmer, Whitney M. Young Jr., Roy Wilkins, Matthew Amen, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, and of course, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech.
Although one of the officially stated purposes of the march was to support the Civil Rights Bill introduced by the Kennedy administration, several critics saw the bill as insufficient. John Lewis, the leader of the SNCC, was the youngest speaker at the event. His original speech was asked to be censored by the Kennedy administration because of its harsh language towards the government. Even still, he used phrases like, "In good conscience, we cannot support wholeheartedly the administration's Civil Rights Bill, for it is too little, too late." He made other derogatory statements towards this bill that angered many of the civil rights activists from SNCC, CORE, and SCLC because it was counterproductive and it was hindering the positive image that they were trying to build around the movement. It ended up being only a small blip on what was an extremely successful event, which was a turning point in U.S. history.
March on Washington proved to be a crucial turning point in the fight for racial equality, and had many lasting impacts on the people of America. Important legislation, marches, and events of a similar caliber drew inspiration from the March on Washington. In the years following the march, African Americans gained the ability to vote. Laws forbidding discrimination of people for any reason were passed, and similar marches such as the Selma March took place. This event also demonstrated to all of America just how far the African American people had come since the days of the bus boycotts in Montgomery, with the March on Washington leading the charge for these changes in American legislation and culture. America had always thought of itself as a melting pot of cultures, and today we can truly call it that because of how we accept everybody and treat them with natural rights we so value everyone in America to have.
Further reasoning for the March on Washington's importance was the ability to unite the races together in the pursuit of a common goal on a larger scale than ever seen before. The government was very supportive of this cause and collaborated in the organization of the event with many of the black leaders. Many white citizens also took part in the march as well, showing their support for their fellow countrymen. This presence of white protesters demonstrated the hope for an unsegregated world. This march was also the beginning of what would become a common place to protest in Washington. For example, there were 5 mass marches in just 2007 alone. They all advocated different causes, but the peacefulness of the protests were all the same. A lasting effect of the March on Washington was the lasting knowledge it instilled in those of future generations. People now see that peaceful protests are the best way to get your point across. Now people take to the streets with signs instead of torches. The March on Washington not only had an effect on black people, it also had an effect on the whole country, forever unbeknownst to most people at the time.